Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Aleem Maqbool. Now, Aleem is the new religion editor for the BBC, but Aleem has worked for the BBC for a number of years. He's worked across the globe. He's worked in North America, but also spent many years in Pakistan. So we'll be exploring a bit of the world faith situation. Aleem, it's fabulous to get you on the Godcast. How are you?
Really, really good to be here. I'm well, actually, like you, very busy all the time. It feels like I've not got enough hours in the day, but that aside, things are good, thank you.
So, first question, Aleem, how's the new job going?
Uh, it is going really well in that I moved back to the UK after 17 years abroad for the BBC. So, like you say, I was in all the US for a while, for 7.5 years, but before that, Pakistan and Afghanistan and Egypt. And there was something inside me after 17 years. The pandemic did all kinds of things to all of us. And for me, it suddenly made me think I really want to be home. And that was a big part of why I left sort of foreign news. So it's been amazing, being back in the UK, getting to know my country again. I was only dipping in and out to come and see family for 17 years. And the jobs really, look, the kind of aspects of faith have sort of been a thread throughout my journalistic career, and I suppose even before that. And so, why I got into this is because I love finding out what makes people tick and meeting people and chatting. And I'm just meeting the most fascinating, brilliant people and lovely people as well. There have been tough stories on the way, but so far it's going brilliantly because of the people I'm meeting all the time.
Did you miss the UK when you weren't here, Aleem? Was it kind of a homesickness, yearning? What was the kind of relationship when you were living afar?
You know, it was an exciting life in some respects. I was covering, we were the first sort of foreign team at the building when bin Laden was killed, and I was 15 feet in front of Donald Trump when he gave his acceptance speech on election night in 2016. I traveled with Obama to Africa. I traveled with Trump around Asia, and actually went to Buckingham Palace with Trump when he came on his state visit. And all of that sounds, I'm meeting incredible people and getting under the skin of life in all kinds of places. And in many respects, it was very exciting. Um, I didn't realize until the pandemic came along. When the pandemic came along, we all had to sort of stand still. It was the first time I thought I'd stood still for about 15 years. And it was suddenly, I felt very far away from my closest friends, like my brothers and sisters and and my actual family as well. And now I'm back. Um, I came back for a few months last year. Newsnight asked me to come and work with them last year. And it's the first time I'd spent more than 2 or 3 weeks in the UK. And I realized that I had missed a lot of cultural things about the UK. And it sounds ridiculous, but including humor, you know, I just think there is something about, culturally that I was missing all that time. I didn't realize it until I got back. And honestly, since I got back in April, I feel like I'm sort of laughing inside all the time at things people say and the way people act. And it's just, that's what I was brought up on. And it's just, I feel so much more settled around that kind of thing. But um, I was definitely missing a lot. And when the pandemic comes along, I couldn't even, not that I would, but I couldn't even cheat the system to come and see friends and family because there were no planes, for example. And I suddenly thought, I there's too much that I miss. And those few months last year at home, I think I had sort of been in denial about what I was missing about this country.
Mhm.
And it's difficult, like I say, to put my finger on it. It's not just about humor, it's all the kind of cultural references and everything, the things that we were brought up watching on telly, all these kind of things. They don't sound like big things, but I realized that it's just part of all of what makes this home and why I'm loving being back.
Well, it's good to hear that you're happy to be home. Just
Oh,
touching on Donald Trump there, Aleem. There's a man there who kind of stood on a platform of Christian virtues, and I guess you probably saw him quite a lot a bit off camera. Did you find any of his qualities endearing, particularly with a Christian aspect, or is it what you see is what you get with him?
you know, uh, he's a complex character, and I think if you just go on what he tweets, a lot of it is for show. I went to so many of his rallies in 2016, and it was almost in some ways like he was sort of honing a comedy act. He was seeing what got the biggest applause, and then he'd expand that a bit more. And if it got more applause, he'd expand it. And some of it, so his message sort of morphed. He loves getting the applause. He loves being center of attention, of course. He's very charismatic. Um, it was it was interesting. You're right. I remember in early 2020, I went to every year they have sort of an anti-abortion rally uh, in Washington, D.C. And there were a lot of people there who were, who it was the first time that this rally, which is held every year, the Right to Life rally, that was addressed by a president. It's the first time a president had come along. Donald Trump came along. And, I saw priests in tears, jumping up and down,
Mm.
excited to see him. And it was just fascinating that they could set aside the moral stuff. I mean, there have been lots of women who've accused him of sexual assault. There are lots of issues about his personal life, his integrity, all of these kind of things. They're willing to set that aside for practical things, for the Supreme Court to change, to sort of help abortion laws change. So it was interesting. I think even then, a lot of people thought, I remember going to an evangelical church before the 2016 election. I remember the pastor there saying, we're not electing a preacher, we're electing a president, and we just want someone who will do something. So he even recognized that there are obviously aspects of this guy that don't quite sit right. And, this is a guy who has changed his mind on all of these issues over the years. But as long as he does something practically, then we're okay. And I think a lot of people looked at him that way, that there were lots of things which were a little bit unpalatable. There were lots of people, of course. And you have to remember in 2020, in the US, more people voted for Donald Trump than they did in 2016.
Mm.
It was just that more Democrats came out.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were very happy with what they were saying. And from a Christian perspective, it's a lot to see that and get past the moral stuff, the stuff about his character.
Yeah. And if we, I think we're going to be on a bit of a whirlwind trip around the world here, Aleem. If we turn our attentions to Russia and Ukraine, I think something that I haven't really seen feature an awful lot in the news, but these are two fundamentally very religious countries, aren't they? And I was wondering what you felt the role of the church could be in the dispute there, between the particularly in Russia, and whether the church is strong enough in its own right as an institution to challenge Putin, or whether it's kind of like in China where it's kind of you can worship, but it's on our terms.
I don't think it's even like that, in that I don't think the church necessarily wants to challenge Putin. I think the way the Russian Orthodox Church has gone for a long time, in some senses, it's sort of Putin's narrative fits the narrative that the Russian Orthodox Church has had for a little bit of time. The Moscow Patriarchate, the part of the Orthodox Church that is sort of directed by Moscow, has been quite nationalist for some time. And just as angry as Moscow was that Ukraine was trying to pivot away from Moscow politically towards Europe, they're just as upset about the fact that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church has broken away, which happened only in the last few years. That really upset the church in Moscow as well. So yes, you have to think back to the kind of communist era where, like you're suggesting, that how does the church survive those days unless they sort of allow the KGB to be involved in the running of the church, or helping select who the patriarchs are and that kind of thing, or who the representatives are that are sent to the World Council of Churches. But we've seen, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, bless soldiers. He hasn't used the words holy war, but he's definitely suggested that this is a war on those kind of terms, that this is also the Russian Orthodox Church certainly sees itself as a kind of bastion of true Christianity, the original Orthodox Christianity. And so it's not necessarily, there are definitely people, there are elements of the church that are upset about this and find it difficult to justify anything where civilians are killed or oppressed or come under pressure. There are other elements within the church that definitely feel that this is not just a nationalist cause, but it is a kind of a religious cause.
Yeah, it's a worry, isn't it? And what about from the Ukraine position? Um, can you maybe enlighten our listeners and viewers about the church in Ukraine? Is it influential in any way?
Oh yeah, it is a very sort of religious society. I mean, it's less than 20% that's Catholic, and then so the Orthodox Church is broken up into those who did continue to follow the Russian Orthodox Church based in Moscow, and then the recently created Ukrainian Church. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church broke away in 2018, and so there's a split between the two. I did go to Ukraine. It was actually the first story I did in this role, was to look at the kind of religious dimensions of all of this. And part of Russia's justification for this war is to protect those who were still followers of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. So those people in Ukraine, it was to, some of the justification coming from the Kremlin is, we're doing this to protect those people so they can worship freely. Actually, when you go there, I spoke to people who said, look, we didn't really care which church we went to. We sort of went to the church that was closest to us. And if it was Russian Orthodox, if it was Moscow Patriarchate, we'll go to it. If it was Ukrainian, odd. And then this comes along, and actually the people who have suffered the most are people in the East, who are more likely to be Russian Orthodox, people going to the Russian Orthodox Church. But I go to you go to places in the West, and you see that there are still churches that are directed from Moscow, and people still go there. That there have been, before this conflict, this war, before Putin's invasion, there were some issues where it was felt that the Ukrainian security services perhaps weren't allowing freedom of speech in some aspects, but they weren't killing people in the way that is happening now. And curiously, like I say, some of the people that Moscow says it's protecting to allow them to worship are the ones who are really, really suffering.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that insight, Aleem. If we flip over to Iran at the moment, Aleem, where well, goodness me, it's really kicking off there, isn't it, at the moment? And the death of Massa Amini is opened up a huge hornet's nest of issues. Has that surprised you, Aleem, that that's happened, or has it not come as a shock to you at all?
I think it surprised everyone. I've got a lot of colleagues here. We're very lucky in the BBC to have a big Persian service who've, there are eyes and ears in many ways on the ground. It surprised a lot of them, but the question is, of course, where it leads. These are certainly, it feels, the biggest kind of, obviously there's been dissent behind the scenes, but the Iranian regime has the capability to be very brutal. and that's what suppressed it. I think what surprised my colleagues in BBC Persian is the extent to which people have taken to the streets in all corners of the country, and that this hasn't just been about something has changed where women are more freely going out without covering their hair, for example. They're walking past, you know, security officers and are doing it in such numbers that they've not yet been attacked. And it's been surprising as well the way in which men have joined in these protests as well. The unanswered question is where this leads. It feels right now that something has changed, at least in terms of one aspect of the control exerted by the regime, which is on how women dress. That may have changed, but I think everyone that I know on the, you know, who's following what's going on the ground, they realize that the regime has got the capability to crush this if it wants to in a brutal way. But it's, you know, but a lot of people would die. A lot of people have already died. So it's the lasting impact that this had that is still a huge question.
Do you think that this has got the potential to spill into other Islamic countries? Do you think this is the kind of conversations and feelings that are there in places such as Pakistan, where you spent such a long time?
They're very different society. There are other closed societies. I think, you know, places where there are kind of religious police, for example, like Saudi Arabia, some of the other places around the Gulf are, you know, more comparable. Pakistan, I mean, it's not quite the same in terms of it has become more, I suppose, conservative since the late you know, since the 80s, basically, since the late 70s. It's not quite the same. It's a very unique sort of society, of course, in Iran since the Iranian Revolution, and the way in which, for example, in Pakistan, you know, in elections, there's never been a kind of religious party that has ever, you know, won elections out there. It's slightly different. There in Iran, of course, you've got very direct governance coming from clerics. So the spillover, the most comparable sort of societies are perhaps, you know, places, you know, Yemen or Saudi Arabia, but they see themselves as very different to Iran. So I'm not sure is the answer to that, but I don't know. It's not like the Arab Spring where you have lots of very comparable issues across a region and one kicks off lots of others. But you know, who knows?
Yeah. And as the world gets more kind of liberalized, Aleem, I wonder what consequences this has upon not just people of an Islamic faith, but anybody on the kind of the potentially the extremes of a theology, you know, whether it's Christianity, Islam or Judaism. There's a challenge there, isn't there? Because that you know, women are becoming more educated. Women are having access to social media. The world seems to become quite a small place. What's your thoughts about that?
I think it has opened up discussions everywhere about what faith is for, what religions are for. Is it about liberty? Is it about freedom? Is it about allowing people to live their lives the way they want, or is it about something else? Look, you say that some people, you know, that women are becoming more educated, but obviously there are societies where they see that as a threat. You look at Afghanistan and the Taliban coming in, and it's been more than a year now that women haven't been able to go to school because it can only be that although I know a lot of people in Afghanistan who say it's almost playing to a crowd of trying to be more conservative than the next person to say that they're very religious, that they don't actually believe it. But I think there is still a strain or a dimension to the way the Taliban operates, that they do see women and they're getting educated as a threat. But part of it is just, you know, and we do see this further a field, you know, in other religions. I mean, I even, you know, you see it even in the US, dare I say, with people trying to be more conservative than the next, to say I'm a better person. You know, you get to elect judges and police chiefs in parts of the US, and in the South, you'll get pastors coming out and saying we need to lock away people for longer, or we need to, you know, bring back capital punishment and those kind of things, who are trying to say I'm, you know, I'm more religious than the next guy.
Yeah.
And so that is that there are definitely things that can be looked at across religions that we can learn, where we can learn from what's going on.
Yeah. And on this whistle stop tour around the globe, Aleem, I mean, I wish we could talk. I could talk to you for hours, but I'm very keen to get your expertise and insights. It's a place that's close to a lot of people's hearts. I'm heading out to Israel next year. You know, the whole kind of Holy Land situation doesn't get an awful lot of airtime at the moment. Just give us your kind of overview of how things are out there, and some of the challenges ahead as you see it.
Well, I was based in the region for, I mean, it's a long time ago now, 2007, I went out there to Gaza. Actually, you might remember a BBC colleague of mine, brilliant colleague of mine, Alan Johnson, was kidnapped at the time, and I was replacing him. Actually, he was kidnapped just a week before I was due to go out and replace him. So I went out there then, 2007 to 2000, about 2.5 years. I've been back to the region since. It is, what can I say about why it's not on the news, first of all? You know, it's been rumbling on, frankly, for decades. If you're on the ground, it is well worth, and I know you're going next year, and I know you've been before. Once you see things on the ground, it is quite stark. You drive around the West Bank, or you go to Bethlehem, and you see the way, you know, people have lived all their lives now, having to go through checkpoints, having to, you know, just going to the village next door within the Palestinian territories, having to go through Israeli checkpoints and all that kind of thing. I think the difficulty there is, and the reason I don't think it's any less entrenched than it ever was, is that there is more separation between Israelis and Palestinians. They understand each other even less. Palestinians don't relate to the security issues that the Israelis live with. They don't understand that. They don't see them as human. And similarly, Israelis, in many cases, don't really feel that there's an occupation going on. So, you know, it doesn't really impact their lives until a war starts. But also, because they've been separate from Palestinians, don't see them as human as well. So I think it's a really dangerous place that things are in that respect, that actually they see each other as the other, and there's no measure of being able to understand each other at all. And so, you know, the West Bank now has got huge settlements breaking it up, and so there are lots of Palestinian pockets. Gaza's, you know, essentially sealed off. And there is I don't see how they interact more, it's really difficult to see where the hope is, I've got to tell you. Because you think that a young generation will come and see, you know, be able to interact, but they just don't. They're so separate that it's difficult to know how this moves forward.
Yeah, it's very sad. And kind of coming full circle here, Aleem, here in the UK, I think in recent weeks, personally, I thought we saw the very best of the Church of England in the way it conducted Her Majesty's funeral. But beyond that, there's some challenges ahead for the church in the UK. How's your kind of interpretation of what the church has got ahead of it, and whether it's still got an important role to play in society here in England?
Well, I mean, I think people's eyes have been opened through the last few years, and this is not just about the church is about all faiths. They've recognized that through crises, through the pandemic, you'll know all about this, that faith organizations, the church has been on the front line, through the pandemic, through cost of living crisis, in dealing with refugees, asylum seekers coming from Afghanistan. It's been faith organizations that have been at the front, on the front lines, as I say. And I think there's a recognition of that. And also, young people, I've spoken to so many now who had, unanswered questions when it came to the pandemic. So, right, I'm sure I want to talk to you about these things, but, people who thought, actually, I don't have all the answers from what's around me, and have reached out to faith or, spirituality to try and answer those questions. And actually young people as well, I'm just getting this sense that they don't have the kind of hang-ups that maybe my generation, our generation has, that they see their footballers, praying, their footballers from, South America praying, or from the Middle East, and the film stars or pop stars they follow from the US talking about God on their Instagram and their TikToks, and they don't have these kind of hang-ups. So I think there's a recognition that it is part of life, but there are always questions about how these organizations, these institutions, these religions move with the times as well. Look, we can't get away from it. It will keep coming up, issues around sexual orientation, around this kind of subject matter will keep coming up, and it did again in Lambeth. However much they didn't want it to be on the front pages, it ended up being on the front pages. That's what a lot of the focus was. But there are loads of challenges, and I think, it's been really interesting to come back to this country and learn about the landscape, because around Easter, you'll remember when the Rwanda policy was being talked about in Easter sermons, Archbishop of Canterbury and Archbishop of York, and lots of people across the country, lots of priests around the country have been talking about the Rwanda policy. And then there was all this kind of church versus state argument about what right these people had to comment on political aspects of our life. And actually, it's an interesting debate, because if you are expecting them to pick up the pieces when things go wrong in a pandemic, then maybe they should have some say, and maybe they should provide moral leadership when perhaps others aren't. But then even on moral leadership, again, there are questions for a lot of faiths and religions about moral leadership and how they've dealt with safeguarding and these kind of things. So look, it's a complex, we could talk all day just about that and about the role of the church in life going forward. But I think they've proved, all kinds of faith groups have proved in the last few years that they are still very much part of society, and there are some areas in which they lead.
Yeah. Aleem, I think we've covered an awful lot of ground in 30 minutes. I'm just interested to know, I'm not particularly about your own faith, but are there places in your job over the many years you've been, spiritual places that have kind of had the wow factor upon you, where you've just gone, wow, this is, this may not be my faith, or this may not be what I believe, but wow, this is an incredible place. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a place that, for me, in Jerusalem, is one of those places. Just to kind of bring this interview to a close, a few highlights, maybe.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. She'll kill me for mentioning this, but I took my mum to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and she burst into tears. And I said to her, I was like, what are you bursting into tears for? It's got nothing to do with you. And she didn't want to leave the place. And she did the same thing at the Church of the Nativity. There is something about those places. I mean, I was lucky enough in 2008 to walk for BBC News from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And we tried as much as possible to think what might have been taken in those, 2000 years earlier. but it was just going through that. It's very strange. It wasn't about the buildings, and it was the same. So I covered the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. It wasn't about the buildings. It was almost about the hills and the mountains and those areas and how much history there was there. For me, it's not strangely been about buildings. It's been about landscapes that have felt given me the most the most awe-inspiring. And when you think back to what came out of those places, and the point where Moses was believed to have seen the kind of promised land and all this kind of thing, those kind of spots around the landscape for me have given me chills.
Yeah.
Because of almost from a historical point of view, the names that you walk through in that area are almost the names of fairy tales, Jericho and
Yeah.
and so on. There's something about those names so evocative. And I felt similar feelings in the kind of areas around Mecca and Medina. And it's that, like I say, that gave me chills.
Yeah, well, I get that. Somebody who lives very close to Pendle Hill, the landscape tells me a lot about the industry around here and the history of Burnley. And Aleem, it's been wonderful talking to you. I want to wish you all the best for your blossoming new role and wherever it takes you. Thank you for doing it, because it's a really important part of journalism, and it's important that people get coverage to see some of the things that you cover. So Aleem, thank you so much for coming on the Godcast. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. It's been really good speaking with you, and I'm looking forward to seeing your book behind you there.
God bless.